So today we have Dr. David Kirkpatrick with us. He will be speaking on the topic, A Gospel for the Poor, Mission Integral and the Latin American Evangelical Left in the Shadow of the Cold War. Dr. Kirkpatrick holds a PhD in World Christianity from the University of Edinburgh, and where he also spent a year as a teaching fellow before he moved as a T. Gannon postdoctoral associate in American religious history at Florida State University. Currently, he is associate chair and associate professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion at James Madison University in Virginia. Dr. Kirkpatrick is widely published, and he is the author of 3 books. One is which is already published, Gospel for the Poor, Global Social Christianity and the Latin American Evangelical Left, the book based on which today's seminar will be. But there is also a forthcoming book this year, Global Visions of Violence, Agency and Persecution in World Christianity, which he has co-edited with the historian Jason Bruner, and to be published by Rutgers University Press in this year. And he's also working on his 3rd book with Oxford University Press under the title Blood and Borders, Violence and the Origins of the Global War on Christians in Latin America. We are very glad to have you, Dr. David Kirkpatrick, with us today, and I hand over the rest of the time to you for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Mutaraj, and thank you all of you for having me here. It's great to be back, even though virtually, with you all in Cambridge, and I have such great memories of time at the Cambridge Center for Christianity Worldwide with the Faculty of Divinity at Cambridge, as well as across the UK. So many conversation partners and those who've been influential to me in my own intellectual development. I want to also acknowledge Professor Brian Stanley's here, who's been a wonderful conversation partner with me for many years and has influenced my thinking deeply. So my talk this evening, or afternoon or morning, wherever you are, is based on archival research from 5 countries and from bilingual interviews with many of the main characters that you'll hear in the paper today. I also look forward to our conversation afterwards. And I hope that the reflections will be relevant not only to academics, but also to practitioners, knowing where the center especially is positioning itself. So let me share my screen here with this PowerPoint. Can you all see that? All right. So in 1965, the Catholic guerrilla priest Camilo Torres penned an op-ed in the Colombian newspaper La Gaceta. Writing in the shadow of the Cuban Revolution, Torres pleaded with university students to join the Colombian armed resistance in a Marxist revolution. Torres wrote, "It would be fruitless and disgraceful if Colombian students who've been the spark of revolution remained at its margin for any reason, due to lack of information, to superficiality, egoism, irresponsibility, or fear." The following year, however, Torres was dead, killed in his first combat experience, a failed ambush of Colombian government forces. Torres's perceived martyrdom, alongside the death of Argentine Dr. Che Guevara the following year, inspired a generation of university students, fueling the fire of discontent with the political, social, and religious status quo. Marxist revolutionaries, however, were not the only voices pleading with university students to join their cause in 1965, 1966. Peruvian evangelical leader Samuel Escobar, who's on the left here, as well as in the middle picture on the right, and as well as peeking behind Billy Graham, the evangelist there in the picture on the right, he penned his own letter to students stuck on the sidelines of Latin America's revolutionary arena. Escobar at the time was a staff member with the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, or IFES, as a traveling secretary on university campuses. I know many of you are aware, but for those who are not, IFES is the global body that arose out of national movements such as the US InterVarsity Christian Fellowship or Universities and Colleges Christian Fellowship in Britain, UCCF. In 1966, he wrote Dialogue Between Christ and Marx, which appeared in the IFES Spanish language magazine Certeza. Escobar rejected Marxism as a superstructure, pushing instead for the conversion of their Marxist neighbors. He concluded the article with a call to evangelize leftist students with a probing question. Why haven't you paid careful attention to Jesus's message of transformation, of redemption as a response to the desperate human situation? For Escobar, theology and revolution were fused by the searing heat of post-war Latin America. Evangelicals not only aimed to produce divergent results from their Catholic and Marxist counterparts, but their audience required a distinctive toolkit altogether. While Escobar's 1966 article revealed their uniquely evangelical aim, Ecuadorian theologian Rene Padilla, who's in the middle picture, is on the left with those wonderful glasses. His article from the same year highlights their strikingly divergent audience. Padilla, who is also a traveling secretary, oops, that's not the slide I wanted, who's also traveling secretary with IFES, and yes, that was the slide I want, penned this that year. The greatest practical question confronting the Christian student in Latin America today isn't if a Christian girl is or is not permitted to wear lipstick, but the course of action one should take in the presence of prevailing social problems and ideologies that pretend to be able to solve them. Padilla wrote to Latin American evangelical students rather than the sympathetic Marxists and aimed at the perceived social retreat and pervasive moralism in evangelical churches that they attended. At first blush, his statement bordered on the absurd. In 1966, university students grappled with the pull of revolutionary action, including the compatibility of guerrilla warfare with Christian orthodoxy. Yet as Latin America continued to experience the aftershocks of the Cuban Revolution, Protestant evangelical churches were often more likely to discuss the morality of female fashion than political action. For this reason, a Latin American evangelical left has been widely overlooked and even thought impossible. While Latin America has been widely credited with inspiring Catholic social teaching, especially theologies of liberation, and we'll come back to this point, the same context has been widely overlooked in the story of Protestant evangelicalism. Latin American evangelicals shared the socio-political context while negotiating a unique path as a religious minority community in an overwhelmingly Catholic continent. They drew from personal biographies filled with anti-Protestant acts of violence, oppression, and discrimination, in addition to pervasive inequality and repressive military governments. This was, according to Padilla, quote, part and parcel of life for non-Roman Catholic Christians and others in pre-Second Vatican Council days in Latin America, unquote. On this divergent road, an embryonic progressive coalition of evangelicals began to develop a social Christianity that would challenge evangelical political and theological loyalties around the world. In exploring this story, I want to front the influence of Rene Padilla, not least because he passed away this year, at the age of 88, but also because of his influence in developing a contextual Latin American theology that addressed the unique contours and challenges of global South evangelicalism. This makes Padilla, in my mind, the most influential evangelical theologian from the global South in the second half of the 20th century. Rene Padilla's fascinating story invites us into a deeper and wider analysis of post-war evangelicalism, one more where an impoverished Ecuadorian evangelical would challenge global North Christians in power and long-standing theological and political loyalties around the world. His was an influence that would join American Baptist preacher Billy Graham and British evangelical Anglican clergyman John Stott on the stage at the epical Lausanne Congress of 1974, but also an intimate friendship with power brokers like Stott, even camping in the Patagonia Mountains together with the Padilla family. Padilla's influence reached some of the largest non-governmental organizations or NGOs in the world, providing a theological framework for organizations including Compassion International, World Vision, and Tear Fund. The story of Rene Padilla and his closest colleagues, who I call the Latin American Evangelical Left, reveals a complex intersection of oppression and injustice, a productive but fraught relationship with British and American missionaries, and experimentation with new forms of evangelical theologies that would reflect their own biographies and experiences in the global South. So in the brief time that we have together, I want to make three broad gestures in exploring the reshaping of global evangelicalism and as seen through the lens of Latin American evangelicals and the rise of their form of a gospel for the poor. First, the power of community. Second, the power of context. And third, the power of conversation. Each, I contend, holds value for understanding the past, but also providing tools for understanding our present moment in our increasingly diverse communities and world. So first, the power of minority community. The reshaping of global evangelicalism brought influential religious minorities to the table of decision-making, not just for those who held a majority in their home countries. The Latin American evangelical story in the first half of the 20th century was in many ways a reverse image of the white evangelical experience in the United States. Latin American evangelicals were just beginning to form significant communities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, while their counterparts in the US were battling what they perceived as broad threats to US culture and Christianity. The theory of evolution, German higher criticism, especially German higher criticism, and an increasing Catholic population, which surged during this time as well. Many US evangelicals, especially within the fundamentalist movement, viewed themselves as managers over US culture and those holding a God-given responsibility to protect the Protestant heritage of the US. But to the global South, Latin American evangelicals were themselves perceived as the threat to Latin American culture, especially in the view of many in a broader Catholic majority. This often resulted in violence, oppression, and marginalization across borders and political changes. And of course, my current book project, if you have questions on that, explores that as well. The Latin American evangelical experience as a religious minority community profoundly shaped their view of their Christian faith and what it meant to engage with the society from a position of marginality. Latin American evangelicals experienced the daily struggles of the general population with an added twist, challenges that endured into the post-war period. So for Latin American evangelicals, due to the influence of many local Catholic priests, Protestant children in some countries were rejected by local schools, leaving Protestant parents with few educational options beyond missionary schools or homeschooling. One historian, Erica Helgen, who's a friend of mine at the Yale Divinity School, has demonstrated that priestly promotion within the Catholic hierarchy was sometimes tied to the success of anti-Protestant campaigns, including violent ones. And her work is fascinating, getting into the diaries and especially church archives in Brazil, noting these discussions of who should be promoted and how they did at rooting out Protestants from their communities. Indeed, this was the case. In addition to systemic discrimination in those cases, many Protestants were also the recipients of explicit violence. Indeed, this was the case for two of the most prominent leaders of the Latin American evangelical left, Peruvian Samuel Escobar, who's second from the right in this picture, and Rene Padilla on the right. These stories, interweaved with crucial developments in Latin American intellectual and social history, provide insight into the unique challenges of being evangelico in Latin America. When the Ecuadorian evangelical Rene Padilla was 2.5 years old, his family moved from his birthplace in Quito, Ecuador, to neighboring Colombia in 1934, as his father sought a better market for his tailoring business. The Padilla family was part of a wider Latin American story of massive rural-urban migration in the first half of the 20th century. Colombia was experiencing unprecedented economic growth, especially in the textile industry, numbers that rivaled even Great Britain during the 19th century. Bogota also experienced a population boom that was typical of Latin American cities, and we'll talk more about this later on. Padilla's father, Carlos Padilla, was, as Padilla put it, a tailor by necessity and an evangelical church planter by choice. Both Padilla's parents, who became evangelical Christians before he was born, through the influence of Rene's uncle, Heriberto, who, according to Padilla, was one of the first evangelical pastors in Ecuador. While economics was the impetus for crossing borders, evangelism drove their family to move, often within the city of Bogota itself. The Padilla family's evangelical activism did not go unnoticed by some local Roman Catholics. Multiple arson attempts were made in the Padilla household, while numerous church buildings were burned down around them. Rene was unable to attend first grade because the local school rejected Protestant children. A woman from their church taught him at home instead. When Padilla was able to attend school, the challenges only increased. At the time of my interviews in 2013, Padilla bore scars from stones thrown at him as he walked down the streets of Bogota as early as age 7. The Padilla family moved back to Ecuador when he was 12 years old, fleeing this religious persecution. But Ecuador did not provide the safe haven the Padillas sought, however. Both Rene and his older brother Washington, who's second from the left in this picture, were later expelled from school, Rene for not attending a Roman Catholic procession, and Washington for arguing with a teacher from the Bible. Twice people came to their home to burn it down, but were stopped by police. And this was interesting to hear this both in oral historical accounts, but also in diary accounts like John Stott's travel diaries in London also noted some of these stories that he heard in the 70s. Back in Quito at the age of 16, Padilla launched his preaching career doing prison ministry with an HCJB missionary, and HCJB was the call name of the radio station there. Soon after, Padilla expanded this ministry into open air preaching. Padilla remembered being chased out of the town square by mobs incited by a local priest. And this was a very common pattern that we see, especially in the first half of the 20th century. The language of a mob being incited by a sermon or some sort of organization, especially from a Catholic priest. And oftentimes it was something quite minor, like bricks being thrown through a church windows, and sometimes to the extreme here, like assassination attempts. By the time Padilla was 18 years old, multiple attempts had been made on his own life, including an assassination attempt while preaching outside his father's new church. Looking back, he simply notes that this was part of being a faithful evangelical Christian in a social location. He said you had to identify yourself as an evangelical Christian, and if you did, you had to pay the consequences. This experience of marginalization gave Padilla an acute desire to understand how the Christian scriptures spoke to his context in Latin America. As an economic migrant and as a member of a religious minority community, Rene Padilla came of age within a context of violence, oppression, and exclusion. In other words, the relationship between suffering and theology was an organic one for him, though he lacked social theological categories at the time. Padilla later recalled, quote, longing to understand the meaning of the Christian faith in relation to issues of justice and peace in a society deeply marked by oppression, exploitation, and abuse of power, unquote. For Padilla, what he called his inherited Protestant evangelical understanding of the gospel, however, provided little answer to the questions posed by a Latin American context. In his mind, it spoke strongly to an individual vertical salvation while remaining muted on social dimensions of the gospel to address horizontal issues. The question was not whether the gospel spoke to a radical Latin American context, but how. So secondly, the power of context, and in particular, the power of a Cold War context. The reshaping of global evangelicalism took place in part through the rise of contextual theologies, where leaders had to grapple with this crucial reality. More evangelicals lived in the global South, especially in context of poverty, oppression, and justice, than anywhere else in the world. And leaders from those contexts demanded a place at the table for their inclusion. And of course, I realize saying this with the Cambridge Center for Christianity Worldwide, that there's more Christians in the global South, is a bit like telling a fish that's swimming in water, but it's obviously important to note here as well for this story that what's happening on a global scale is being amplified here as well in Latin America. Padilla, of course, was by no means alone in his animating search for answers to Latin America's religious questions. An entire generation of Latin American theologians shaped by the global Cold War insisted that the church should center on the poor. In Pope Francis's words, to build a church which is poor and for the poor. the intense ideological struggle of the global Cold War, the undeclared war between the United States and the Soviet Union that dominated international affairs roughly between 1945 and 1991, was an extension of European colonialism and the proving ground of ideologies forged in Moscow and Washington. Both sides attempted to determine the destiny of the developing world, often through means of economic coercion, political assassinations, and propping up repressive military regimes. And of course, this in particular is nodding to CIA interventions in Latin America, their work in terms of training, of course, local armies, in some cases assassinating democratically elected leaders, etc. From within this socio-political ferment, a generation of religious elites, both Catholics and Protestants, attempted to mold new theologies to fit this Latin American reality. To put it succinctly, the global Cold War was the seedbed of social Christianity. By social Christianity, I mean, there we go. I mean forms of Christianity that argue sin infects not only individuals, but also systems and structures, that salvation is not only individual, but also societal. And for those who hold to this, as a result, the struggle for justice is a requirement. We'll talk more about what this looks like in terms of Latin American evangelicals. In 1959, Padilla earned a bachelor's degree in philosophy and master's in theology from Wheaton College in Illinois, which is widely considered the most academic evangelical institution in the US. And the Padillas moved to Columbia that year while the intellectual, social, and religious, as well as political ground was shifting beneath them in every area of Latin American society. I want to highlight one piece of that context, which was important for being a contextual causal factor here. Paired with tumultuous political realities, migration set the stage for revolutionary action throughout the region. Another example of how Padilla's journey was paradigmatic. His journey, especially as a child of migration, was part of a wider story. At the turn of the 20th century, wider trends in migration began to reshape the internal structure of Latin American life. In 1960, one political scientist observed the tail end of these migration patterns, saying, "There is no Latin American country in which there is a trend away from urbanization. Everywhere the impressive fact has been the movement toward the city, the swelling of urban populations," unquote. In 1930, the Mexican census, for example, Mexico City, the capital, contained 961,000 inhabitants. By the next census a decade later, the city had nearly doubled in population to almost 1.5 million inhabitants. Peru, in another example, recorded similar urban growth during this time. Lima City contained nearly 300,000 inhabitants, according to the November 1931 government census. Less than a decade later, the population increased nearly twofold to over 500,000 inhabitants in 1940. This trend only continued as Lima's population reached over 800,000 in 1950. So we see this incredible population growth, doubling and tripling in size. After the Second World War, Protestantism began to gain a foothold as urbanization provided a new context for new social context for religious life. Protestant churches found acceptance at the margins of this new urban environment, growing in places that traditional Roman Catholic structures largely struggled to reach. And there were lots of reasons for this, but in part due to pervasive priest shortages in the region. The growth of Protestant churches also coincided with the increasing involvement of US foreign policy in Latin America during the Cold War era. After the Cuban Revolution of 1959, in which forces loyal to Fidel Castro overthrew the democratically elected Cuban president turned dictator, Fulgencio Batista, the Argentine doctor Che Guevara promised to export Marxist revolution throughout Latin America. But rather than, it's fascinating if we read what he says, it's coming to every country in Latin America. What's happened in Cuba is going to be everywhere. And of course, this makes the US very nervous in particular. But rather than a Marxist leftist revolution, nearly every Latin American country in the decades that followed that received a repressive military regime. Costa Rica is the only exception. Mexico, by some argument, but nearly every Latin American country is going to receive a military regime. So to be Latin American in the post-war period was to experience unjust governments that favored landowning elites, repressive military regimes, and widespread inequality. In some cases, Latin American military dictatorships were friendlier to Protestants rather than to Catholics, as Catholic hierarchy held power and influence while increasingly siding with the poor. And that's kind of a surprising note, I think, for many. By implication, many Latin American Protestants were seen as foreigners in their own land, labeled gringos or Yankees. Many Roman Catholic priests, as we mentioned, and authorities also viewed Protestant evangelistic efforts toward Roman Catholics as imposing on their religious turf. And so some played into these fears by stoking up mobs for violence. This is a through line that we see the first half of the century, the first half of the 20th century, even into the 50s and 60s. We see this in Colombia. I'm working on an article for American Quarterly on that very point. These migratory socioeconomic and political patterns funneled into the Latin American university context. I won't bore you with the details, but nearly every a major Latin American university also exploded in size during this time. This is the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, the main university in Mexico City. Just take a look at this data here. 1928, about 7,500 students. By 1950, this number is 25,000. And then by the year 1960, 70,000 students at UNAM. And so by 1960, the student population that year reached the aggregate of the entire decade of the 1940s and 1950s, just in that year alone. So what we're seeing is the movement of people from rural areas to cities is also going to funnel into Latin American universities. And this is going to stretch Latin American cities beyond their structural capacities. Because industrialization was not, did not follow urbanization in terms of equal measure. While countries like Colombia saw industrial growth in the 1930s, similar to Great Britain in the 19th century, the growth tapered off after 1945. Industrialization and economic growth were unable to keep pace with the demand for work. And so here's why this matters, if that feels random. This story of rural-urban migration, the accompanying influx of university students, and receding economic opportunity set the stage for revolutionary action in cities across Latin America. The epicenter was the university, and this is where Padilla, Escobar, Arana, Orlando Costas, all were based at Latin American universities during this time. Escobar and Padilla with the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students. The conversations that took place on Latin American university campuses set global evangelicalism on a crash course. At the heart of these campus conversations were stories of revolutionaries that gripped these students, like the story that I mentioned at the beginning of Camilo Torres. As traveling secretaries with global university ministries, they maintained constant contact with students and campuses across Latin America. They found themselves at the center of student political agitation within what Padilla would later call a continent characterized by revolutionary ferment. For Latin American Protestant evangelicals, there was also often an added layer of dependency and foreign influence. So even within an environment where there's a real sensitivity towards American influence in the region, their communities were often dependent on North American money, personnel, and religious ideas. The imported theologies often spoke little to the political pressing context. Escobar remembers asking one of his mentors, an American missionary, what do we know about theology in the Bible? What does it say about Marxism and the pull of revolutionary action? And he was given a book by a Southern Baptist missionary that was translated into Spanish and that had nothing to do with political context. And so he also speaks about just feeling like there was nothing there for them in terms of theological resources. Their growing discontent produced a context where emerging social Christianity and renewed calls for national leadership flourished. This was in essence the Cold War context for Latin American evangelicalism, the intersection of imported political and theological influence from the North and socio-political ferment in the South created a third path for the emergence of new holistic and nationalized ideas Young Latin American evangelicals Padilla, Escobar, Arana, and the Puerto Rican Orlando Costas began to search for materials with which they could address this revolutionary situation. And rather than rejecting the evangelical theology that they had received from North Americans, they sought to strip it of its white middle-class American packaging to formulate a gospel for the poor, the marginalized, and the suffering. Thus, similar to theologies of liberation, new forms of Latin American evangelical Christianity built upon layers of dependency with diverse materials from the Cold War context. These realities came to a head in 1969 as American evangelicals, such as the evangelist Billy Graham, again, who you see here on the right next to Escobar, and theologian Carl Henry sought to intervene in the region as the spread of Marxist ideologies, social unrest, and theological innovation worried many US evangelicals. And so what's happening in the World Council of Churches at this time, among a group called Iglesia Sociedad en America Latina, or ISOL, is also making them very, very nervous. Many of them worried not just about the Marxist penetration of Latin America, but about the distraction from primary evangelistic responsibilities and the danger of political readings of scripture. It was here that the power of conversation, global, multi-directional conversations intertwined with agreement and fierce dissent, shaping the movement moving forward. So lastly, the power of global conversation. In November 1969, in the post-war period, we'll start there. Pressure continued to build from Latin American leaders restless with the status quo of financial, theological, and managerial dependence. In fact, the moment Latin American evangelical elites began to publicly reject the importation of American ideas, methods, and resources can be identified quite precisely on the final day of the first Latin American Congress for Evangelization, known as CLADE, in 1969. In November of 1969, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association revealed a master plan to evangelize all of Latin America. They called it the First Latin American Congress for Evangelization, or its Spanish acronym, CLADE. Now, if this Congress had been planned and executed a decade earlier, the result would probably have been unremarkable for our story here. But the ignorance or insensitivity of American conservative evangelical leadership toward a growing backlash against their managerial control produced discernible and surprising results. At a time of widespread fear regarding the communist penetration of Latin America, American conservative evangelical leaders sought to segregate conservative religious leaders from liberal ones and to root out the latter from their organization. And personal letters during this time among leaders trying to figure out who's left and who's right in these conversations is fascinating in the papers that are at Wheaton College in Illinois. They did this in part by hand selecting speakers at CLADE, particularly those from stable democracies, and distributing literature that identified and categorized theologians in Latin America across a conservative versus liberal spectrum. This was, from some American evangelical perspectives, an attempt to secure Christian orthodoxy within global evangelicalism, and not nefarious in itself for choosing those who shared their beliefs and convictions. But for the embryonic Latin American evangelical left, it represented a resurgence of evangelical paternalism and imperialism. It was perceived as a heavy-handed move by American evangelicals at a time of growing discontent with paternalism and American influence. And so the conference's content and what it represented to them, persistent paternalistic boundary making, provoked progressive Latin American evangelicals to action. This was not just the speakers at the conference, but the BGEA also distributed a book by American missionary Peter Wagner, which named and labeled Latin American theologians among this leftist or conservative divide, and said, these people are safe, these people are dangerous. And a copy of it was distributed to every single participant of the Congress. In a 2013 interview in his Valencia, Spain apartment, Samuel Escobar said to me, "We said now is the time that we as Latin Americans decide who is evangelico in Latin America and what it means to be evangelico. And from there came the idea of the fraternity. On the final day of CLADE, an ad hoc group of Latin Americans, including Padilla and Escobar, strategized the creation of their own organization. Thus, perhaps the most notable consequence, and certainly an unintended consequence of CLADE, was the creation of a Latin American evangelical think tank called the Latin American Theological Fraternity, now called the Fellowship, in Cochabamba, Bolivia in 1970. The FTL would provide the space and encouragement to pursue contextual theological answers to the local questions being asked. And so for active campus ministers, the fact that they would have a date on their calendar that they had to produce their paper by, they had to present their chapter that they were publishing by, pushed them to produce and to publish contextual Latin American theologies. Now I also want to note, in oral historical accounts, this is presented as the moment of independence for Latin American evangelicals. But again, if we look at archival materials and personal letters, this is still being funded exclusively by American money. And so behind the scenes, they're also working to decide who should be involved. And I'll add on this, I think it's fascinating. Initially, Rene Padilla is excluded from even the Latin American Theological Fraternity, and Escobar has to say, I'm out. I'm not going to participate if Padilla is not there. And he's included. And of course, it becomes one of the biggest forums for his influence. So regardless of this, these conversations did not stay local. From a revolutionary, changing, and increasingly influential Latin American context, Padilla, Escobar, Costas, and others dragged their local battles to the global stage. CLADE itself also reached beyond Latin America, particularly in the case of Charles Troutman, who was a missionary with the Latin America Mission. When Billy Graham sought speakers for the Lausanne Congress 3 years later, through the Lausanne convener, the Australian evangelical Jack Dane, Troutman saw the need for speakers, Padilla and Escobar, through the lens given by CLADE. Troutman attended CLADE and would later reference the lack of national leadership and contextual theology in his recommendation of Padilla and Escobar to speak at the Lausanne Congress of 1974. Troutman, no doubt provoked by conversations with Latin American leaders, urged Dane and Graham not to repeat the mistakes of CLADE. Troutman wrote in a personal letter, "I would strongly recommend that the steering committee consider that the environment of the third world and that the element of revolution is the natural habitat for the proclamation of the gospel. I think a serious criticism that has been made against the speakers, with one exception, and he's speaking of Samuel Escobar there, at the Bogota Congress, was that they all spoke from the standpoint of stable industrial societies where the majority of ordinary delegates were living in the midst of guerrilla warfare and revolutionary governments. This is a subtle thing for those of us in the Anglo-Saxon world to understand, but unless the gospel is proclaimed in this context, I'm afraid we're not saying what we think we are." Troutman's experience at CLADE impacted his understanding of a contextual theology of mission. But more importantly, Latin American minority communities, contextual reality, and global conversations shaped the Lausanne Congress even before its start. And from there, we'll move to our final focal point, the Lausanne Congress of 1974. In 1974, Protestant evangelical leaders huddled in Lausanne, Switzerland, in a meeting that I would argue rivaled Vatican II in terms of its influence. Nearly 2,500 Protestant evangelical leaders from over 150 countries and 135 denominations gathered in Lausanne, funded primarily by the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. Time magazine called Lausanne a formidable forum, possibly the widest ranging meeting of Christians ever held. Graham summoned leaders to accelerate the evangelization of the world, but in response, he nearly received an evangelical civil war instead. Our emerging and increasingly diverse generation of Latin American leaders had grown weary of American managerial control or the mapping of strategies and spiritual lives on mission fields, decisions made in the United States for the rest of the world. At Lausanne, one plenary speech poured petrol on the fiery protest, providing inspiration and an intellectual framework for the future. As the only address of the day, and you see the picture here from the archives on the left, Rene Padilla rebuked American missionaries for exporting a deadly cocktail of capitalist rhetoric and evangelical salvation. He also rejected their brand of what he called the American way of life, cloaked in a perceived program of racial and cultural segregation. And he is in particular picking on Americans and the US and its role in global Christianity. In its place, Padilla called for a synthesized spiritual and structural solution. Quote, "You see, I've come to see that as a matter of fact, Jesus Christ came not just to save my soul, but to form a new society," unquote. When I interviewed Padilla in Buenos Aires in 2013 in his home, he recalled seeing the reaction of American leaders in particular, arms crossed, frowned faces. They felt attacked, he said. This contrasted heavily with exuberant greetings from mostly what he called third world leaders after the speech. Billy Graham himself ordered a report to gauge how many people agreed with the message, though privately he would accept that what was said needed to be shared. In John Stott's words, Escobar and Padilla had, quote, "put the cat among the pigeons." After Lausanne, the criticism was fierce even within intervarsity circles. For example, British IVF General Secretary Oliver Barclay took issue with the heart of Padilla's Lausanne presentation, the wider dimensions of the gospel. In a letter found in the IFES headquarters in Oxford, on the 25th of September, 1974, a few months after the Congress, Oliver Barclay wrote a personal letter to Padilla, warning him of reaction to his paper in the media, most likely American accounts, and attempting to rein in the young leader. As British Anglican theologian and founding member of the FTL, Andrew Kirk, recalled in a 2014 interview, Lausanne maybe went beyond what a lot of evangelicals at the time would have wanted in that direction of social justice, and the terrible sort of fear of the social gospel and watering down of evangelism. Thus, in his letter, Oliver Barclay warned Padilla, "You must be pretty careful how you express yourself," after rumors swirled regarding Padilla as theologically liberal. Barclay thought Padilla's position was being misrepresented in what he read. Ironically, what Barclay saw as misrepresentation was actually Padilla's position. Barclay wrote, quote, "Social good works are, on this understanding, part of the good news of salvation and not a consequence of the good news of salvation. I know we're arguing about the meaning of the words gospel and salvation, but are you sure that you're really biblical in using it this way," unquote. Barclay knew that Padilla was pushing the boundaries of where evangelical Protestantism had defined biblical views of the gospel message. "I confess to being a little worried," Barclay concluded. At issue was not whether Christians should engage in good works in society, but whether this was inherent to or an implication of the gospel message. Were there social dimensions of the gospel, or simply social responsibility for converted Christians? Barclay's rebuke, however, like other pushback from the Lausanne Congress, only fueled Padilla in his exploration of Latin American social theology. And we could say a lot more about Padilla's influence on other leaders. I mean, John Stott in particular, his diary at Lambeth Palace in London shows this deep influence of Padilla on him. And Stott is also publicly reverses his stance on the role of social action and Christian mission in his monumental book, Christian Mission in the Modern World. To be more specific, after rejecting the American way of life and an exclusive soul-saving mission at Lausanne, Padilla called evangelicals to embrace what was translated at the time as a comprehensive mission. But since he gave his speech in Spanish, what Padilla actually said was Misión integral, a phrase drawn from his homemade whole wheat bread, pan integral. Evangelicals needed a whole wheat mission, Padilla argued, an integral mission that synthesized the pursuit of justice with the offer of spiritual salvation. Today, evangelicals across the political spectrum have utilized this language from Latin America to speak of their mission and identity. Most prominently, over 500 Christian mission and relief organizations, including Compassion International, World Vision, Tear Fund, many others, have used this language. In 2005, Christian organizations made up 6 of the 10 largest American INGOs, and 6 of the 7 largest evangelical mission agencies in the US are primarily relief and development agencies. In 2015, World Vision was the 11th largest charity in the United States with a revenue of over $1 billion that year. All have utilized this phrase, integral mission, to speak of their purpose and framework around the world. The origins of the phrase can be found at Lausanne, arising from Latin American conflict over diversity, justice, and political loyalties. Most global North evangelicals would recognize the legacy of this story while remaining unaware of its origins. These organizations aggressively marketed their mission, especially in US conservative evangelical churches, magazines, radio stations, music festivals, and homes, through pictures of sponsored children stuck to refrigerator doors. Theologically, they no longer justified their presence exclusively through the language of evangelism or saving souls. Indeed, they shifted decisively in terms of what they were saving the world from: souls and bodies saved from eternal separation from God and temporal suffering. This was their integral mission, borrowing words from Renee Padilla. So let me make a few brief conclusions. First, a surprising challenge to global North evangelical political and theological loyalties arose from the shadow of the Cold War. The same generation and location as Pope Francis and many theologies of liberation. The Lausanne Congress was influential because for the first time, leaders from the Global South gained a place at the table of the world's evangelical leadership, bringing their nascent brand of social Christianity with them. Latin Americans had an especially strong voice, for they honed their critique as a religious minority community, many based on university campuses. For them, justice was essential rather than optional, as they sought to mold their religious message to fit their contextual reality. Their story of battling for inclusion for themselves and their ideas has been challenged, obscured, and softened. When seen through the lens of Latin American evangelicals, the reshaping of global evangelicalism and the rise of their gospel for the poor becomes clearer. Secondly, our attention to context here also speaks to a wider and stubbornly persistent stereotype about social Christianity in Latin America. These stories are often told as if any form of Christianity that addresses social realities is a form of liberation theology or a response to liberation theology. In contrast, the reality on the ground was that Protestant evangelicals were responding not to liberation theology primarily, but to a shared set of social and political stimuli that were sweeping the region. In other words, evangelicals like Renee Padilla should be given credit in their own right, rather than placing a Catholic lens pro forma over the story. Thirdly, beyond internal evangelical developments, the story also provides a window into the reality of Latin American religion and politics more broadly. In other words, this story is paradigmatic. And in this sense, the stories speak into yawning and persistent gaps in our understanding of the story of Latin American Protestantism in the second half of the 20th century, particularly how Protestantism has exploded in Latin America and threatened the Catholic majority in influential countries like Brazil, Guatemala, and many others. This story of migration, Cold War politics, religious minority communities, and global conversation all speak to wider realities of the growth of evangelicalism in the region and around the world. Finally, let me speak to the present. These stories from church history, set between Latin America and the global North, provide wisdom arising from conflict, negotiation, and the reading of scripture from context of poverty and injustice. There are rich resources within a global conversation, and we would be wise to listen to global voices, to learn and to reflect in a spirit of humility as we seek paths forward. Thank you.